This one's the one I gotta use for the card. This one right here. Oh, what the fuck? I got some made over here. Okay. Shop rumors compared with official communications and the meaning of such small things as hand gestures. The growing recognition of the importance of the ability to influence another's view of the world was evident in the frequent references to hearts and minds and warnings about what was lost politically by indiscriminate and harsh military operations. The phrase came to be used whenever there was a need to persuade people through good works and sensitivity that security forces were really on their side. As part of a broader strategy of cutting militants off from their potential sources of support, including recruits, intelligence, sustenance, weapons, ammunition, and sanctuaries. The counter-argument went back to Machiavelli, that it was better to be respected than loved, that opponents could be intimidated and demoralized by physical strength, but encouraged in their opposition by concessions. The problem was more an over-facile approach to the hearts and minds concept. In other concepts, heart and mind were pitted against each other, strong emotions versus cool calculations, appeals to values and symbols versus appeals to the intellect. This is reflected in early use by the British General Sir Henry Clinton when facing a similar problem with the upstart Americans in 1776. The British, Clinton argued, needed to gain the hearts and subdue the minds of America. In practice, in discussions of countering both insurgency and terrorism, those opposed to brute force tended to stress gaining hearts more than subduing minds, as if provisions of goods and services would win the support of the desperate population. There were three difficulties. First, as noted, local political loyalties would depend on local power structures, and any measures would have to be judged in terms of their effects on these structures. Second, while there were both undoubted benefits to repairing roads and building schools or securing power and sanitation, those efforts would not get very far if security was so poor that foreign troops and local people were unable to interact closely and develop mutual trust. They were the sort of policies that might help prevent situations deteriorating, but were less likely to help retrieve it once lost. A more minds-oriented approach might establish that trust by addressing questions about who was likely to win the continuing political and military conflict and the long-term agendas of the various parties. The insurgents could sow doubts about who among the local population could be trusted, about what was real and what was fake, about who was truly on one side and who was proceeding. As the insurgents and counterinsurgents played mind games to gain local support, they could be as anxious to create impressions of strength as of kindness to demonstrate a likely victory, as well as to hand out largesse. In terms of the cognitive dimensions of strategy, this was an important as any feel-good effect from good works. Both would depend on the actual experiences of the local population and local leaders and the mental constructs through which it was interpreted. Third, this strategy required greater subtlety than just an awareness that different people had different cultures. It was hard to argue against an improved sensitivity about how others view the world and the need to avoid ethnocentrism. Culture was itself a slippery term, often being used as something that envelops individuals and shapes their action without them being able to do much about it. The term could include almost anything that could not be explained by reference to hard-nosed matters of interest. Attempts to define another strategic culture often then came up with something remarkably coherent, without contradiction and almost impervious to change. At least among academics, this approach was largely given way to a practice of referring to some received ideas that help interpret information, navigate events, but which were subject to regular modification and development. We shall return to some of these ideas in the last section of this book when we develop the idea of scripts. The importance of an exaggerated view of culture was that it could lead to the assumption that alien attitudes and uncooperative behavior reflected the persistence of an ancient way of life, untouched by modern influence, asserting itself whatever the conditions, against the suggestion that individuals were socialized into hard culture, sharing assumptions, norms, pattern of behavior, and forms of mutual understanding that could be implicit, unspoken, and taken for granted that were all but impenetrable to an outsider. Was a possibility that in a dynamic situation where commodities were being subjected to new influences and challenges, cultures were likely to develop and adjust and become less effective in binding people together. Thus, observed Porter, in the literature on reconstructed Islamist warrior people's insurgencies fed by culture difference. It was as if the people encountered did not act but are acted upon, and personal historic forces taking orders from the culture and the modes of warfare are singular and fixed by ancestral habit. People were able to learn and accommodate with their culture's new types of weapons and forms of conflict. References to the durability, hatreds, and evocation of culture symbols could encourage stereotypes of the primordial and the exotic as harmful as those that assumed that all people were seeking to remake themselves in a Western image, explaining problematic behavior as a consequence of people set in their ways. Being set in their ways was not only condescending, but also let off the hook those in the intervening forces whose actions might have prompted a hostile reaction, and underestimated the extent to which opponents in a prolonged conflict would interact and pick up ideas, weapons, and tactics from each other.